The second part of Dante's influential Divine Comedy is called Purgatorio. Whereas in the first he travels down through hell, here he ascends through purgatory. Purgatory as a concept is not something universally accepted amongst Christians today, but in early 14th century Italy it was well known. Though not mentioned explicitly in the Bible, generations of theologians and philosophers had thought through questions concerning prayer for the dead, penance for sin, divine mercy, the nature of hell, and the perfection of heaven, and concluded that there must be some way or some process in which the souls of the dead who weren't eternally damned were purged of the remnants of the sins which had been forgiven in life and made perfect for their eventual arrival into heaven. And prayers for these souls by the living would help them through this process. Thus, Dante travels through purgatory as the middle journey between hell and heaven, and along the way he encounters plenty more figures, some of whom are more obscure to a modern audience and some less so. Which means that my own purgatory also continues as I explain who all these characters are to you, my dear lovely audience. This video is a continuation of a previous video that I released going through all the characters of Dante's Inferno. You don't have to watch that one to appreciate this one, though I will be making reference to some concepts that I explained there, and especially related to the historical background of Dante's life, so you may find it worthwhile. But anyway, you know the drill by now. Let us ascend the slopes of the mountain of Purgatory together. Once again, I've got a couple of caveats to get out of the way before we start. I am once again using the Durling and Martinez translation of the Divine Comedy, the second volume this time, and a good deal of the information I'm presenting here, especially about the more obscure characters, is coming from their extensive notes. Secondly, as with the Inferno, I'm only going to go over characters who actually appear or are present in Purgatory, not those who are just named or referenced. There are some exceptions, as was the case last time, but here it's mainly in the examples in each terrace of Purgatory. As we'll see, each terrace contains virtuous examples for the penitent shades to emulate or look up to as they're purged of their vices, as well as examples of figures who succumbed to the relevant vices as examples of what to avoid, sort of like an Inferno 2.0. When it comes to these, I'm only going to mention characters who don't appear elsewhere in the Divine Comedy, i.e. nobody I've either already mentioned or will mention in Paradiso. So, for example, Mary is mentioned frequently, but she's in Paradiso, so I won't bring her up, and Julius Caesar is also mentioned, but I already talked about him when we saw him in Limbo. I'm also only going to mention individuals, not groups of people, like the Hebrews in the desert or the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, unless I feel like it's really narrow, which is to say, if I really want to. Okay, now let's get started. We last left Dante and Virgil climbing out of hell and emerging on the opposite end of the earth. Here they're on an island containing a massive mountain reaching up to the sky, Purgatory. Wandering the shore, they encounter our first new character, the guardian of Purgatory, Cato the Younger, a traditionalist Roman politician and Stoic thinker from the late Republic who opposed the rise of powerful individuals acting as autocrats, and ultimately killed himself after Julius Caesar's victory over Pompey the Great in their civil war. Cato's presence here has caused generations of readers to scratch their heads. He was a pagan, an enemy of Julius Caesar, and he committed suicide. By all measures, he should be in hell, at best in limbo with the other noble pagans. But for Dante, getting his information from Lucan and Cicero, Cato was considered the prime exemplar of Roman virtue. He was a defender of justice and liberty, which Dante connects to the perfect state of those in heaven, and there was a commonly held view in Dante's day that Cato's suicide was actually an admirable act. Unlike the suicides in hell, who were violent towards themselves, Cato's suicide was selfless. His death was a sacrifice. Cato killed himself as a scapegoat, hoping that the shedding of his own blood would save Rome from further civil war. He chose the good of the commune over his own personal good, which is how Cicero defines justice, and Dante, therefore, saw him as the exemplary citizen for his ideal empire. Cato killed himself for Rome, whereas Brutus and Cassius, in the depths of hell, stabbed Rome for themselves. It was also common in the Middle Ages to compare Cato's self-sacrifice to Christ's, which further elevated his moral virtue. Because of all this, in combination with the fact that Cato died before Christ's resurrection, it seems Dante imagines that he was taken up out of limbo with the virtuous Old Testament figures during the harrowing of hell, though it may be significant that they're all in heaven while Cato is still on the earth, at least until the end of days. Anyway, Cato basically corrals the shades of the newly dead over to Purgatory. The shades in question arrive on a boat, piloted by an angel, and as Dante and Virgil head over, Dante encounters someone he knew. This is Casella, a recently deceased Florentine who seems to have been a dear friend of Dante's, though little is known about him outside of this text. Dante notes that he used to sing either about love or lovingly. The Italian could be translated either way. And he starts singing one of Dante's own poems before Cato tells them off and shoos them towards Purgatory. And so they obey, getting to the foot of the mountain. But before Purgatory proper, they reach the ante-purgatory, where those who repented their sins late have to wait for a while before they can actually enter Purgatory and start working off those sins. The first group they encounter here are the excommunicated, who repented on their deathbeds. They have to wait 30 times the length of their excommunication, unless, as with the whole of Purgatory, the living say prayers on their behalf, which can reduce this time. Throughout the poem, this means that many of the shades bombard Dante with requests to ask their living relatives to pray for them once they find out that he's actually still alive and will be returning to the land of the living at the end of his journey. Amongst the excommunicated, Dante meets Manfred of Sicily. Manfred was the son of Frederick II, who we saw amongst the heretics in hell, and his mistress Bianca Lancia. Manfred was the regent of Sicily on behalf of his brother and then his nephew, and then usurped the throne for himself in 1258. Although not emperor, his relation to the Stauffer dynasty, and inheritance of his father's poor relationship with the papacy, meant that he was aligned with the Ghibelline cause and helped Ghibelline factions retain power in many of the city-states of northern Italy, and this was also the cause of his excommunication. Ultimately, this would all change when the popes called on Charles of Anjou, brother of King Louis IX of France, to take over the kingdom of Sicily, which he did after defeating Manfred at the Battle of Benevento in 1266. Manfred died at Benevento, but Dante subscribes to a version of events where Manfred repented his sins as he lay dying, a narrative which the Church denied. Significantly, despite Dante's view of the papacy of his day being corrupt, he still viewed excommunication as having power, regardless of the legitimacy of its issuing, a common argument in the Middle Ages against its use and abuse for political aims. A little further are the neglectful, who repented late out of laziness and negligence for their souls. Here they see Belacqua, or Duccio di Bonavia, a lute maker who was a neighbor and acquaintance of Dante's and was apparently quite lazy. Interestingly, archival evidence suggests he may have only died in 1302, though the poem takes place in 1300. In any case, Dante's relieved to see that he's not in hell. Next are those who were killed violently, and who repented as they were felled, which is certainly where Manfred would be too if not for the excommunication. First up, though unnamed, is Jacopo del Cassero, a nobleman from Fano who served as podesta of several cities. In 1298, while podesta of Milan, he was assassinated by his rival Azzo VIII d'Este. Next we see Buonconte da Montefeltro, son of Guido da Montefeltro, the mercenary turned Franciscan, who was one of the counselors of fraud in the Inferno. Buonconte was likewise a Ghibelline-aligned mercenary captain who died at the Battle of Campaldino in 1289, in which Dante himself also fought, though on the opposite side. Then we see a woman named Pia, otherwise unknown, who says she was from Siena and was murdered by her husband. Her parallel to Francesca da Rimini in Canto 5 of the Inferno has led many to assume that she was likewise murdered because of infidelity. We next get several characters who swarm Dante, asking him to inform their families that they're not in hell, so they'll pray for them. Benincasa da Laterina, a judge killed by a highwayman for having sentenced two of his kinsmen to death, followed by one who may be Guccio de Tarlati, who drowned while either pursuing or being pursued by the enemy after the Battle of Campaldino. Federico Novello, killed while aiding the Tarlati against the Guelph Bostoli of Arezzo, and a man known only as He of Pisa, a son of Marzucco da Scornigliano who was murdered sometime in the 13th century, but whose name remains unknown. Then there's Count Orso of Mangona, the son of Napoleone, one of the brothers from the circle of traitors in the Inferno who killed each other. Orso was killed by his cousin Alberto to avenge his own father, Alessandro, the other brother. Finally, there's Pierre de la Brosse, chamberlain of Philip III of France, hanged in 1278 for supposedly plotting against the king, though it was widely believed that evidence for this was forged and that de la Brosse was framed, likely by the Queen Marie of Brabant, with whom he had a rivalry at court. Further on, Virgil and Dante encounter Sordello, a poet from Giotto near Mantua who wrote poetry in Provençal after escaping to Provence due to a whole situation where he abducted his lord's wife at the behest of her brothers, possibly because she was being mistreated, and they may have had an affair afterwards. He also served as a counselor to the Counts of Provence and was eventually knighted. Honestly, sounds like his life would make a great movie. Sordello then points to a bunch of rulers amongst the late repentants. First is Rudolf von Habsburg, the first Habsburg Duke of Austria, as well as the first to rule as German king. Sordello calls him Emperor Rudolf, though he was never actually crowned emperor, and Sordello criticizes him for his concessions to the papacy, saying he had the chance but failed to heal the wounds that killed Italy. Next to Rudolf is Ottokar II of Bohemia, his rival for the imperial title, who fought and was killed in battle by Rudolf, though now they sit side by side with Ottokar comforting his former enemy. After them, Sordello points to the kings Philip III of France and Henry I of Navarre, referred to as the father and father-in-law of the Plague of France, i.e., the current king of France by Dante's time, Philip IV, who Dante saw as a cruel and corrupt ruler, and I'll get more into the details of why that is later. Next are two more former rivals, who are now singing together, Pedro III of Aragon and Charles of Anjou. As I mentioned before, Charles was a relative of the kings of France who took Sicily from Manfred at the invitation of the popes. Pedro was Manfred's son-in-law, married to his daughter Constance. In 1282, a rebellion, known as the Sicilian Vespers, broke out on the island of Sicily, which Pedro supported and ultimately led to him obtaining the island through his wife's claim. By the way, I specify the island of Sicily because the Kingdom of Sicily also included the southern mainland of Italy, which Charles managed to hold on to. So at this point you have two kingdoms calling themselves Sicily, though we often today refer to Charles's kingdom as the Kingdom of Naples to avoid confusion. Behind Pedro there's also a boy, one of his sons, though it's not entirely clear which one. Anyway, further on we see Henry III of England, who Sordello notes lived simply, though this could either mean with a lack of luxury or that he was simple-minded. His son Edmund was originally granted Sicily by the popes, but Henry wasn't able to push those claims, so they gave it to Charles of Anjou instead. Next is William VII of Montferrat, aka Il Gran Marchese, who waged wars for dominance of Lombardy, which ultimately led to his death. He was an ally turned enemy of Charles of Anjou. After pointing out these various monarchs from afar, they head down into the valley where they're all hanging out, and Dante spots someone he knew personally. Nino, short for Ugolino, Visconti. Dante calls him a noble judge, since he'd been a ruler of Galluria in Sardinia who were called judges. He was also the grandson of the Count Ugolino in the Inferno, the one eating Archbishop Ruggieri's head, and Nino was actually the one to lodge a legal complaint against Ruggieri after his grandfather's death. He's also the one who had Brother Gomita executed, one of the bribe takers we mentioned in the Circle of Fraud. Alongside Nino is Conrad II Malaspina, Lord of Lunigiana, a region between Tuscany and Lombardy. His family was famous, powerful, and known for their tight cooperation, in contrast to much of the squabbling which plagued other powerful Italian families. Not a whole lot is known about Conrad himself, but the Malaspinas hosted Dante for a time during his exile, when he even helped negotiate a peace between them and their rival, the Bishop of Luni, in 1306. By this point, night has fallen. Some angels guard the valley from a big-ass snake, clearly an allusion to the serpent from Genesis in the Bible, and representing how the shades in Purgatory are now free from sin. Dante falls asleep and dreams that he's being carried by an eagle, and when he wakes up, he finds himself at the gate to Purgatory proper. Virgil explains that it was actually St. Lucy who carried Dante, but since we actually see her in Paradiso, I'm going to wait until then before really talking about her. So, Purgatory is arranged into 7 terraces, each representing a vice or moral flaw that needs to be corrected before one can enter heaven. Dante sees these as inclinations towards sinful behavior. Although one's actual actions, actual sins, have been forgiven, the internal tendencies towards such actions remain and need to be purged. This is slightly different from the typical view of purgatory at the time as a place where it's the lingering stains of past sins that are purged, and purgatory is a continuation of penance. But anyway, an angel marks Dante's forehead with 7 P's that will be removed at the end of each terrace. The first terrace is that of the proud, who carry big rocks on their backs, forcing them to stare at the ground. As I mentioned at the beginning, each of these terraces also contain exempla to imitate, as well as those to avoid. Here they're carved into the wall, but I'm not going to mention any of the good examples because they're all figures who appear elsewhere. Amongst the shades, Dante first sees Umberto Aldobrandeschi, who was proud due to his illustrious noble lineage, especially known at the time because of his virtuous father Guglielmo. He was killed by the Sienese in 1259, which Dante implies was because of his arrogance, though details on the specifics differ. Next is Oderisi, a famous manuscript illuminator who was proud of his art. In life, he thought himself the greatest, though now he's coming to recognize the talent of others, especially the younger generations and proto-Renaissance artists like Cimabue and Giotto. He laments the brevity of fame as others inevitably surpass you and take the spotlight, something Dante himself seems to empathize with. Finally, Oderisi points out Provenzano Salvani, representing pride in political power. Provenzano held a dictatorial rule over the Republic of Siena, expanding its territory and, in turn, his own hold over the city. He did apparently repent in life, though, begging others for money in order to ransom a friend of his taken prisoner by Charles of Anjou in 1288, wearing sackcloth and crawling on his knees, which Dante sees as penance for his pride. Dante and Virgil then pass by the carvings of examples of the proud cast down, of which there are several for me to mention. Niobe, who boasted to Latona that her having 14 children made her superior to Latona, having only 2, after which Latona's children, the gods Apollo and Diana, killed Niobe's children and her husband. Saul, the first king of the Israelites, whose pride of office led him to defy God, who ultimately abandoned him and allowed the Israelites to be defeated by the Philistines, after which Saul killed himself. Arachne, who was transformed into a spider after challenging the goddess Athena to a weaving contest and surpassing her. Rehoboam, son of the Israelite king Solomon, whose arrogance led to the northern tribes of Israel rebelling and rejecting his rule. Eriphyle, who betrayed her husband in exchange for a necklace made by Vulcan, and was killed in revenge by their son Alcmaeon. Sennacherib, a Neo-Assyrian king who was murdered by his sons, which, according to the biblical account anyway, was due to the complete destruction of his army after he besieged Jerusalem. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, who, according to legend, was murdered by the Scythian queen Thamyris by drowning him in blood as a response to his murder of her son when he had been captured by the Persians. And Holofernes, the Assyrian general who was killed by Judith, a widow whose husband he had killed, after Holofernes brought her into his tent, arrogantly thinking she wanted to sleep with him. After Dante reaches the end of the terrace and an angel removes the first P from his head, he and Virgil move to the next one, though Dante recognizes that he hasn't seen the last of the Terrace of Pride, sure that he'll spend quite some time there himself after he dies. The second terrace is that of envy, where the penitents sit in haircloth robes with their eyes sewn shut. Here the exempla are shouted by invisible disembodied voices, traveling through the air. Amongst the good exempla, they hear a voice shouting, "I am Orestes," in reference to the companions of Orestes, son of Agamemnon. After they were captured by the tyrant Taurus, who wanted to kill Orestes, they all claimed to be him, wanting to spare the others from death. And in case you're wondering, yes, this is what the famous I'm Spartacus scene from the 1960 film was inspired from. The first shade Dante meets is Sapia, a Sienese woman from the Salvani family, and the aunt of Provenzano Salvani from the last Terrace. According to Dante, she took joy in the sight of her fellow Sienese citizens' defeats at the Battle of Colle in 1269, which incidentally is where Provenzano was captured and then killed. This may have been out of resentment due to her exile. Dante then sees two more shades together. Guido del Duca, a Ghibelline from Romagna who was a judge of Faenza and Rimini, and who Dante says was jealous of anyone else's happiness, and Rinieri da Calbotti, a Guelph who partook in several factional conflicts in Romagna and served as podesta of several cities, though Dante gives us little to explain his envy. The voices then speak more examples, this time negative ones. They say, "Whoever finds me will kill me," alluding to Cain, who I already talked about in the Inferno when we got to the section of hell named after him. New, though, is the example of Aglauros, whose sister Herse had attracted the love of the god Mercury, or Hermes. She had initially agreed to help him meet her sister, but stirred to envy by the goddess Minerva, or Athena, she refused to let him in, after which Mercury turned her to stone. Next is the Terrace of Anger, where the penitent shades are burdened by a thick, blinding, stinking cloud of smoke. Here Dante receives the examples in the form of visions, the first of which is a vision of the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus, who convinced his wife not to punish the young man who kissed their daughter. He also receives a vision of Saint Stephen, an early church leader who was stoned to death by Judean authorities after being accused of blasphemy, and who prayed to God that he take pity on those who threw the stones. The only shade Dante encounters here is Marco Lombardo, a man who served as a counselor to several northern Italian princes, though little else is known about him. He and Dante have a conversation about all sorts of things, including corruption and astrological determinism, and Marco's responses are often rather grumpy, so it seems he still has work to do. Dante then receives more visions, and as usual, this time it's examples to avoid. Amongst them are Philomela, who was raped by her brother-in-law, King Terrace of Thrace, after which she and her sister Procne, Terrace's wife, killed his and Procne's children and fed them to him. The sisters then escape by praying to be turned into birds and flying away. Then there's Haman, a minister of the Persian king Ahasuerus who tried to get the king to kill all the Jews in the realm after Mordecai didn't bow to him, and who wound up being executed instead thanks to a plot by Mordecai's niece, the king's consort Esther. And finally Amata, the wife of Latinus and mother of Lavinia, both of whom we met in Limbo, who killed herself in furious protest that her daughter was going to marry Aeneas. Next up, the fourth terrace, that of the slothful, who have to constantly run back and forth as though they were doing
the fitness gram pacer test,
all the while shouting the examples of zeal and sloth. The examples of zeal are Mary and Caesar, so I'm going to skip right to the penitent shades, which is actually just one, Abbot Gerard of San Zeno in Verona. Almost nothing is known about him, though Dante may be making a general jab at abbots more broadly, who tended to have cushy and sometimes not very active lives. He also seems more interested in criticizing the current abbot in 1300, Giuseppe, who was the crippled illegitimate child of the Veronese lord Alberto della Scala who placed him there. The shades then shout out some examples of sloth, but these are broad without ties to specific figures, so I'm going to skip them too. But before getting to the next terrace, Dante sleeps and dreams of a siren, one of the creatures whose song leads sailors to their deaths, most famously avoided by Ulysses during his voyage home from Troy. Several early commentators also identified her as Circe, an enchantress who seduces Ulysses and his crew to stay on her island, after which she turns his crew into pigs. Both of these serve to represent the seductive pull of misdirected love towards temporal things, which categorizes the remaining terraces. The fifth terrace is that of the greedy, who lay face down on their stomachs since, in life, their eyes were fixed on earthly goods. Dante first sees Pope Adrian V, who was pope for only 38 days before his death, but, according to Dante, the weight of the responsibility of being pope made him realize the error of his earlier greed. Dante and Virgil then hear one shade speaking examples against greed, including Fabricius, a Roman politician who was consul in 282 BC, and who refused the bribes of Pyrrhus of Epirus, who we saw amongst the tyrants in hell, to betray Rome. Fabricius died poor but virtuous. Another example is St. Nicholas, who secretly snuck gold through the window of an impoverished Roman politician, giving it to the man's 3 daughters so they would have a dowry and wouldn't have to become prostitutes, doing so secretly to also preserve the father's reputation. This story, by the way, is the origin of Santa Claus sneaking into people's houses to give them gifts. So Merry Christmas. The man speaking these examples is Hugh Capet, elected King of France in 987, and progenitor of the Capetian dynasty, which still ruled France in Dante's own time, and branches of which would continue to rule France until 1848. Dante relates a legend that Hugh was the son of a butcher, but in reality his father was a powerful French lord, also named Hugh, and his grandfather was King Robert I. Hugh is more here to denounce his descendants for their greed and other sins, including King Philip IV of France for his attempts at controlling the papacy and his execution of the Templars to escape his debts to them, a very recent event by the time of Dante's writing, his brother Charles of Valois for his participation in the exile of the White Guelphs from Florence, Charles of Anjou, who we saw earlier, and his son Charles II of Naples/Sicily. Hugh Capet continues his denouncement of the greedy by giving us the examples of avarice. Pygmalion, the brother of Dido's husband Sacaeus, who killed the latter to steal his wealth, and which led Dido to flee to Africa and found Carthage. Midas, the Phrygian king who wished that all he touched would turn to gold, and regretted that gift when even his food turned to metal. Achan, from the biblical book of Joshua, who stole some loot from Jericho for himself, and was stoned to death by the other soldiers when they found out. Ananias and Sapphira, a husband and wife from the Acts of the Apostles, who kept for themselves a chunk of the profits from selling a field belonging to the church community. Heliodorus, the treasurer of the Hellenistic king Seleucus IV, who was kicked in the head by a horse sent by God when he tried to plunder the Temple of Jerusalem. Polymnestor, a king of Thrace who, after the fall of Troy, killed Priam's son Polydorus, who'd been entrusted to him for safety in order to keep the boy's gold. And Crassus, the triumvir alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, who was famously rich and greedy, and who, according to some accounts, had gold poured into the mouth of his severed head by the king of the Parthians who had defeated him in battle, saying, "You thirsted for gold, now drink some." Before reaching the next terrace, Dante and Virgil encounter the Roman poet Statius, known for his Thebaid, on the 7 kings against Thebes, and Achilleid, on the life of Achilles. He's also a big fan of Virgil's and is thrilled to see him. Virgil, however, is a little confused and asks Statius how he was greedy and how he became a Christian. Statius answers the first question by saying his sin wasn't so much greed, but its opposite extreme, reckless spending. As for his Christianity, something which isn't attested anywhere historically, though was an established legend in the Middle Ages, Statius says that he was inspired by Virgil's 4th Eclogue, a poem which Christian thinkers had long recognized sounded very much like a prophecy of Christianity, and which the Church Fathers largely concluded was, in fact, inspired by God, though that Virgil was unaware of this when writing it. Statius then sought out some early Christian preachers and converted, though he hid his Christianity and pretended outwardly to still be a pagan. Statius actually just finished his 1200-ish years in Purgatory, and so he follows Dante and Virgil for the rest of the journey. Next, they reach the 6th terrace, that of the gluttons, who starve tantalized by tall trees with big, juicy fruits which lie just outside of their reach. A voice coming from one of the trees speaks the examples of the temperate, including Daniel, the Old Testament Jewish noble who was taken to serve at the court of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian exile. Daniel fasted rather than ritually defile himself with Babylonian food, and was granted divine wisdom as a result. In this terrace, Dante sees Forese Donati, a good friend of his and the cousin of Dante's wife, Gemma Donati. He's also a relative of the many Donati mentioned in the Inferno. They were a big and powerful Florentine family. In the Tenzone, a collection of sonnets back and forth between Dante and Forese in which they playfully insult one another, Dante makes fun of Forese's gluttony, which is probably why he's here, although it should be noted that there is debate as to whether the Tenzone is genuinely Dante's. Forese then points out several other penitent gluttons, including Buonagiunta da Luca, a poet and notary who may have brought the 13th century Sicilian school of poetry to northern Italy, Pope Martin IV, who was known to be fond of eating eels drowned in wine, Ubaldino della Pila, a Ghibelline count and the brother of the heretic Cardinal Ottaviano and father of Archbishop Alighieri, both of whom we've seen in hell, Bonifacio de Fieschi, the Archbishop of Ravenna from 1272 to 95, about whom little else is known, and Marchese degli Argugliosi, a noble from Forli who was famous for his excessive drinking. A second tree then speaks the examples of the gluttons, but the only specific character mentioned is Eve, who we'll see in the Paradiso. The final terrace is that of the lustful, who walk around in circles in a big old ring of fire. Dante and company carefully walk along the edge. The shades and the flames shout out examples of chastity, including the virginal goddess Diana, specifically mentioning the story where she banished the nymph Helike, otherwise known as Callisto, after finding out she was pregnant, having been raped by Jupiter. Though, to be fair, Diana only knew that she was pregnant, not how she got pregnant. One of the lustful, who speaks to Dante, is Guido Guinizelli, a jurist from Bologna, though Dante knew him especially as a poet, calling him father, for his role in developing the sweet new style of poetry which Dante was a big fan of. This style is probably why Guido is here, though, since it deals especially with themes of love and burning desire. And lest you think Dante is being hypocritical here, I should note that it's well established that throughout the Inferno, and especially Purgatorio, Dante reflects on his own sins as he discusses those of others, especially in cases like this where it's someone close to him. In fact, this reflection is the whole reason he's on this journey in the first place, as we'll soon see. Anyway, Guido then points out another poet, Arnaud Daniel, an important Provençal troubadour who had a big influence on Dante and likewise wrote widely on themes of desire and eroticism. The lustful run in groups, with those who lusted after the same sex going in the opposite direction of those who lusted after the opposite sex, greeting each other when they pass each other by. They shout out examples of lust, and Guido adds a couple more. The only character for me to mention in these examples is Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos, who created a wooden cow for herself to hide in so the king's prized bull would mate with her, after which she gave birth to the Minotaur. Finally, Dante, Virgil, and Statius pass through the flames and make it to the stairs, which lead to the summit of Purgatory. Here, Dante again falls asleep and has another dream, this time seeing Leia, picking flowers and making a garland. Leia is the older sister of Rachel and daughter of Laban in the book of Genesis, where Laban originally tricks Jacob into marrying her when he actually wanted to marry Rachel. In the Middle Ages, both sisters were seen as symbols of the virtuous life, Leia of the active and Rachel of the contemplative. Leia's picking of flowers here signifies the cultivation of moral virtues through one's deeds, which helps one overcome the vices that are corrected through purgatory. One who has been fully purged becomes like Leia. The next morning, Virgil crowns and miters Dante as sovereign over his own self, now fully able to govern himself with reason as his vices have been burned away. Although Virgil will continue to follow Dante for a bit, he's no longer his guide, and he leaves at some point between cantos to return to Limbo. Regardless, Dante reaches the top of the stairs and enters into the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise. Eventually, he encounters a woman picking flowers by the water who acts as his new guide for a while through the garden, explaining the garden's nature and perfection. Everything here is perfect, in the sinless state that existed before the fall of man, a state in which the purged souls find themselves once again. This woman is named Matelda, though who exactly Matelda is one of the most enduring questions of the Divine Comedy. It's very likely that she's meant to be some historical figure, but which figure is debated. Some of the most popular proposals are the German mystics Mechthild von Hageborn or Mechthild von Magdeburg, or else the Countess of Tuscany, Matilda da Canossa. More recently, Moran Cruz has argued that she's actually Saint Matilda of Saxony, the wife of Henry the Fowler and mother of the first German Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, tying the sense of her idealistic perfection to that of the perfect ideal state, which would be very much in line with Dante's political views throughout this poem and his other works. With all that said, others have pointed out that Matilda isn't actually named until 5 cantos later at the very end of Purgatorio, so although Dante likely had someone historical in mind, her identity may not have been as important as her actual words, though others have various other explanations for this, which I won't go into right now. Dante then sees a great procession with various symbolic figures. At the front are 24 elders representing the books of the Old Testament, then 4 winged animals representing the 4 evangelists and their gospels, and 7 others representing the rest of the New Testament. It's not clear whether these are the actual authors of these books themselves, so I'm not going to go into them too much. But anyway, there's also an elaborate chariot pulled by a griffin, whose dual nature as half eagle, half lion is often seen as representing the dual human-divine natures of Christ. On either side of the chariot are 2 groups of women dancing. These are the typical medieval personifications of the virtues. In the first group, you have the 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity, or love. These are the virtues which only those who have received divine revelation can obtain. The other group is of the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. These are the virtues that can be obtained through rational contemplation, the virtues promoted by the ancient philosophers. At long last, coming down from the chariot, veiled and mantled, is Beatrice, the one who sent Dante on this journey in the first place. Beatrice is widely believed to be Beatrice Portinari, the daughter of a wealthy banker who lived near Dante. Dante first met her when they were both 9 years old, and then only met her again on one other occasion when they were 18. But she had such a major impact on him that he remained in love with her for many years, even after her death in 1290 at the age of 25, and despite the fact that they both married other people. In his Vita Nuova, Dante portrays her as the object of his courtly love, and grapples with the pain which was caused by her death. Back in Purgatorio, Beatrice immediately chastises Dante for his misdirected love after her death, saying that once she was out of his mind, he moved towards vice and folly. She explains that she sent Virgil to bring him on this journey to save him, giving him a chance to be corrected. Dante and Statius are then baptized by Matelda in the river Lethe to cleanse them of the memories of their sins, and Dante finally gets to stand beside Beatrice and gaze upon her smile, which might seem insignificant by modern standards, but is actually rife with meaning in the context of medieval Romance literature. The procession then continues with a whole bunch of symbolism related to the fate of the church, including its gradual corruption over time, which includes all sorts of imagery from the Book of Revelation, which I'm not really going to go into. But just know that it ties into Dante's political views about the corrupt, temporally focused church and weak, stunted empire being the cause of the world's problems. Beatrice then reassures Dante that one day all shall be cured, and tells him to write down all that he's seen. Matelda then baptizes Dante and Statius in the river Eunoe, where they're refreshed and the memories of their good deeds are restored, and Dante is now ready to rise to the stars. With that, Purgatorio comes to an end, and so does this video. This one's slightly shorter than the Inferno just because there are fewer characters directly involved. A lot of the cantos are filled with erudite discussions about various topics, which are extremely interesting, though they're outside the scope of this series. In fact, I actually find those parts the most interesting, though I get why some people might find them dull, especially if they're less familiar with some of the medieval concepts behind those discussions. In any case, I will be visiting Paradiso at some point. Haven't decided yet if I'm going to go directly into it or maybe make another video in between. I'm far from being sick of Dante, but I recognize that not all of my audience is going to be as interested in this kind of video, and I make videos about once a month, so, it's a big gap for anyone who's not that into this series. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed. As always, I thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.